Okay, hello, this is David Kelsey, and I'll be today presenting the lecture on René Descartes and his meditations on first philosophy. To begin the lecture, I just wanted to discuss the idea of skepticism. Skepticism is the view that we cannot know, we cannot have knowledge. And so, for example, the skeptic claims that we can't even know things like that we're here right now, right? Or that the sky is blue, things like this, right? Skepticism can be sort of divided into two types. The first we call local skepticism. Local skepticism is skepticism about some particular set of beliefs, right? A kind of classic example is, some people are skeptical about the moon landing, right? And this is just to say that they're not sure that the moon landing actually ever occurred, right? There are all sorts of other things that we might be local skeptics about, right? But local skepticism is always just about a particular set of beliefs, right? Now, the global skeptic, that approach is a much wider approach, right? The global skeptic says not that just we cannot know about whether the moon landing really occurred or not, or, for example, the existence of something like Bigfoot. Global skepticism says, in fact, that we cannot know anything, right? And so it stretches much further. In fact, the global skeptic says the only thing we might be able to say that we know is that we cannot know, right? Now, in the Meditations on First Philosophy, what René Descartes attempts to do is to refute that position, global skepticism, right? Now, René Descartes, he lived from 1596 to 1650. And he was actually a mathematician and a physicist and also a philosopher. And the reason that Descartes actually aimed to refute skepticism was just because he lived during a time when skepticism was kind of rampant, right? It was a time when, we had what's called the Copernican revolution, and science itself was evolving and changing quite a lot, right? People in the past, before Descartes, actually had believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? And so this Copernican revolution comes along, and all of a sudden people are starting to believe that the Earth was moving. Science was changing, and so Descartes was set out to prove this kind of position about global skepticism to be false. Now, what Descartes does is to prove global skepticism false, Descartes adopts what's called now Cartesian skepticism. And Cartesian skepticism is a kind of skepticism that actually is just a temporary, brief, momentary kind of skepticism. And the purpose of this kind of skepticism is actually to refute skepticism. So Descartes kind of becomes a skeptic to refute skepticism, which is kind of an interesting move on his part. It's quite good, I think, right? Now, to adopt Cartesian skepticism, he does this in this famous text called The Meditations on First Philosophy. And so what we'll look at here in this lecture is how he adopts this Cartesian skepticism to then later refute skepticism. So in the first couple meditations in his Meditations on First Philosophy, he's actually what we would call a skeptic, a true skeptic, a kind of skeptic in the worst kind of sense. And what Descartes does is he asserts these kind of in the first couple meditations, he asserts these two very powerful skeptical arguments. The first argument is called the dream argument, right? And the dream argument, the way it goes, right, is he tells us first that if he doesn't know whether or not he's dreaming at this moment, then he cannot know for sure whether he's, for example, reading this lecture right now, right? So applying that to me, for example, if I can't know for sure that I'm not dreaming this moment, then I can't know that I'm reading this lecture at this moment or giving you this lecture at this moment, because for all I know, I could be dreaming, right? Now, he says, secondly, then, I can't know for sure that I'm not dreaming this moment up. Now, his motivation for the second premise, that he can't know that he's not dreaming this moment, is in the past, of course, Descartes seems to argue that there have been all sorts of moments in his life where it's just been unclear whether he's awake or dreaming, right? And so this suggests that maybe at this very moment he could be dreaming. So now, given the first and the second premise, it seems to follow then that he cannot know that he's reading this lecture, or for me, I cannot know that I'm reading this lecture at this moment, right? And of course, even though this argument shows that you can't know, I can't know that I'm reading this lecture at this moment, this could be applied to all sorts of other beliefs, right? Again, for example, that the sky is blue, or that you're here right now, or you're at your house, or wherever you're at, right? And again, the idea is that because it's possible that you're dreaming all those things, then you can't know those things, right? So the next point we want to make here is that this dream argument involves what's called the dream skeptical scenario. A skeptical scenario is a situation in which everything you believe turns out to be false. Right? Here, the skeptical scenario is what we call the dream skeptical scenario. The dream skeptical scenario is, of course, imagine a situation in which you're dreaming up everything that you're currently experiencing, right? And so in this situation, then everything you think was real would actually end up being a dream. It would all end up being false. Okay. Now, the situation here, of course, what Descartes is suggesting then, of course, is that we can't really know for sure that this dream skeptical scenario is false, right? There's no way for us to know for sure whether or not we're dreaming, right? So that's the motivation for the argument. And so he thinks that because we can't know whether or not we're dreaming, then this suggests that we can't really know anything at all about what we're perceiving, what we're experiencing in this moment, right? Okay, so the next argument that Descartes presents us is what's called the evil demon argument. Now, the evil demon argument, it goes exactly like the dream argument. First, he says, if I don't know that I'm not the victim of an evil demon, then I cannot know that I'm here listening to this lecture at this moment. But secondly, I can't know that I'm a victim of such an evil demon, and so therefore I cannot know that I'm listening to this lecture at this moment. The evil demon argument, what he's sort of on about here is the idea of a kind of reverse or anti-God, right? Descartes asks us to imagine a situation in which God is actually not good, but a kind of evil deceiver, right? This is a kind of worst case scenario. Imagine a God, an evil demon that is out to actually trick us in any way he can, right? And this is a kind of evil demon that would basically be casting our world as a grand illusion, right? A hallucination that we were experiencing, right? And what Descartes says is that if you consider this as a possibility, if it's possible that there could be such an evil demon casting this illusion, pulling the wool over our eyes, if you will, then everything that we believed would actually end up being false, right? Our entire world would be an illusion. And so Descartes suggests that because it's possible that there is such an evil demon, then of course I cannot know so much of what I think I know, right? Which supports the global skeptic position. It's important to understand here what the skeptic is up to, right? The aim of a skeptical argument here isn't to suggest that, say, there really is an evil demon, or you are really dreaming at this moment without knowing it. Instead, the aim of the skeptical scenario, what the skeptic is trying to do, is just to suggest that these skeptical scenarios are possible. So it's possible that you're being tricked by an evil demon, or that you're really dreaming right now without knowing it. Now, what the skeptic says then is that if it's possible, if these things are possible, these skeptical scenarios, then there's much that you don't know. And the reason is the skeptic thinks that if it's possible, if you think it's possible that there's this, an evil demon or that you're dreaming right now, then this means that you can doubt the truth of all your beliefs, right? Because you have in the back of your mind this bit of doubt about whether you are really experiencing reality as you believe it to be, right? And so because you can doubt the truth of your reality, this means for the skeptic you cannot know it. The skeptic thinks that doubt precludes knowledge. That's the way I like to put it. So if you can doubt the truth of something, so says the skeptic, you cannot know it. And so because, according to the skeptic, according to Descartes here, right, you can doubt the truth of your beliefs because you may be deceived by an evil demon or you may be in a dream without knowing it. You cannot know, right? You cannot know anything, right? Because for all you know, it all could be an illusion. Okay, so now we next have to think about how we could reply to the skeptic, right? Now, the way Descartes replies to the skeptic is in virtue of his view on justification and knowledge, which we call now foundationalism. Descartes actually thinks that he's going to try to refute the skeptic by building back up all of our beliefs and knowledge. So remember, Descartes has been presenting all these skeptical arguments for the sake of refuting them. So now he's going to refute them by trying to build up all of our beliefs and knowledge back. And the way that Descartes does that is through this foundationalist system. And you can think of the foundationalist system of justification and belief as a kind of building, right? That's the metaphor or the analogy, the metaphor to think about how justification works for the foundationalist. The foundationalist says that at the bottom of this building of beliefs is our foundation of knowledge. And so what Descartes thinks is that if we can have a foundation of knowledge that is kind of skeptic proof, that cannot be doubted in virtue of the possibility of an evil demon or a dream, and then if we can also show that the rest of our beliefs can rest upon that foundation, then we can refute skepticism. We can get all of our beliefs and our knowledge back. And so that's what Descartes tries to do. Descartes tries to give us a certain foundation to work from, a foundation that is unshakable. And then what Descartes tries to do is he tries to give us the means upon which all the rest of our beliefs can rest upon this foundation. And then once he's done that, he's refuted skepticism. So this foundation for our beliefs, he gives us in three parts. Okay, the first part, he says, he argues for what's famously called the cogito. Okay, so this is the first building block, the first piece of our foundation of knowledge. The cogito is famously known as cogito ergo sum, which says, I think, therefore I am. Basically, what Descartes argues here is that in the very moment of thought itself, you must exist. Right? The way to put it is like this. Descartes says, consider this evil demon. Consider this evil demon as supplying you with an illusion. He's pulling the wool over your eyes. And in this case, all your thoughts would be part of this illusion. But then, if you're having thoughts, you must be receiving that illusion. But then, if you're receiving that illusion in virtue of those thoughts, there must be something that's having the thoughts, right? And so that thing must exist, right? A quote from Descartes to kind of sum this up. He says, if there is a deceiver, then surely I exist since I am deceived, right? The way to think about it is, if there is deception going on, then there must be something that's having the deception, that's being deceived. And so that thing must exist. So Descartes then asserts, if he's having thoughts, he must exist. He says in his words, I think, therefore I am. Now, what Descartes then says as a result to this is that I exist is a foundation for knowledge, right? It's what we call a basic belief for the foundationalist. The idea of a basic belief is that a basic belief is part of our foundation of knowledge for Descartes, and it's a belief that's not justified by any other beliefs. So notice that Descartes' belief in his existence, I exist, right? That belief is justified in virtue of thought itself. So it's having thought that justifies the truth of the belief I exist. We can see this more so in the idea that the cogito itself is self-justifying. To say the cogito is self-justifying is to say this. If you're to have the very thought, right, if you will, if you're to have the very thought to yourself, I exist, it's guaranteed to be true in virtue of that very thought. So the thought I exist guarantees the truth of the thought I exist, right? Because thought entails a thinker, right? So this is to say that the belief I exist is self-justifying. It justifies the truth of itself. If you have the belief, the thought in your mind that you exist, that I exist, then it must be true. So this makes the cogito very, very special. And Descartes thinks actually that this means the cogito is a foundation of foreknowledge, right? He thinks that even if there's an evil demon deceiving him, that it must be true that I exist, right? The next piece of the foundation for Descartes' refutation of skepticism, this foundation upon which all our knowledge rests, is the belief that God exists. Descartes thinks not only I exist has to be true, but also the existence of God. And Descartes actually thinks that if you have your own existence and God's, Descartes thinks that everything else is going to rest upon those beliefs, and that we're going to get everything back and that skepticism will be refuted, right? Now here's why. So first Descartes says that God must exist, and he gives us 3 different arguments for God's existence. The first argument that Descartes uses is the ontological argument. Right? We've seen the ontological argument before, right, in the notes. I think it's in lecture 4, I believe. The ontological argument basically says that God must exist in virtue of the nature of God being a perfect being, and it being more perfect for God to exist than not, right? So that would be Descartes' first argument for God's existence. Descartes then moves to the next belief, his next foundation. Descartes actually thinks that because God exists, and also because God is wholly good, that God wouldn't actually allow me to be radically mistaken about the nature of the universe. God wouldn't allow the wool to be pulled over my eyes because God is good. God would block that move. And so in a sense, Descartes thinks that God would block an evil demon from deceiving me in that way. And so therefore, because God exists and God is good, God just simply wouldn't allow a skeptical scenario to be true. And so in this sense then, in virtue of my existence, I exist, right? God, Descartes thinks, and then also God exists, and then third, that God is good, that the skeptical scenarios, Descartes thinks, cannot be true. God would block them. And so therefore, my belief that God exists justifies all sorts of other beliefs, right? Because if we can know, in virtue of God's existence, that these skeptical scenarios cannot be true, that they're impossible, then I can get all my beliefs back, right? I can know all the things that I thought I knew before skepticism became even a question, right? And so this is how Descartes refutes skepticism, by the belief that I exist, God exists, and the belief that God wouldn't allow me to be deceived by an evil demon. Okay, well, that's it for our lecture on Descartes then. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.